So where the dark historical comedy comes in is because they're mirror image utopias. When you've got to translate the ideology into a procedure, they converge on exactly the same statecraft. In 1902, Vilfredo Pareto, the economist, had said, as a matter of purely sort of formal logic, the perfectly efficient free market and the perfectly efficient social planner, total social planning, are mirror images. They're just different coordinating systems to get to the idea that you can have a perfect balance of supply and demand in an economy so that welfare is maximized. Now, when he said that in 1902, it was a purely formal thought experiment. But that mirroring was what would come to haunt first the Stalinist system in the 1950s, when there is an attempt to build total command planning, and decades later, neoliberalism, when we attempt to transform the British economy according to the idea that if the state withdraws, there will be a revealed prophecy of rational, calculating individuals who can navigate their way perfectly in the free market space, constrained only by taste and technology and resources that they can change if they just choose to apply that rationality according to their sort of preferences. Now, where this is really, what makes this a truly transformational change in British political history is that our politics up until then had been, if we take the post-war era, Keynesian economics in the post-war era is very much arguments from observation. These are arguments that say we live in an uncertain world. We live in a world with radical uncertainty that we can never escape. And so the job of the political economy and of governments is to build institutions that make us resilient in that world, to try and build a plurality of institutions and to use a variety of ideas that will allow us to sort of deal with the misfortune of an ordinary life. And that is, in essence, the scientific method in the social sciences. It's the idea that you are attempting practical problem solving by observing the evolving, never-ending, changing patterns in an open-ended society so that you can attempt to build policies and institutions that can ameliorate the most obvious risks. What happens when we move to neoliberalism is we go from the blackboard determinism of mathematical economics to an actual political determinism that says, rather than looking at the historical patterns and the current technologies and what we think we can manage and how we can build institutions to deal with that, it says, no, we have the governing science. That is good for all times and places. What we need to do is to rebuild our institutions so that they conform not to the people and the issues that we can see, but to the theoretical blueprint. And then, because this is a kind of revealed prophecy from the neoclassical economics, then when you strip away the distortions of the state, the fog of communitarian lies, then people will conform and you will liberate them that the true republic is the free market. And in that sense, democracy and democratic institutions become far less significant because the idea that true liberty, the true space of liberty, is how we navigate our way in guided by the providential light of the price mechanism. So now, this is a philosophy festival, so I should say something very quickly about why that can't work. Why it didn't work in the Soviet system, why it can't work in the British system. And if we appeal to the philosophy of science for help, and we go to the Kantian tradition, this would tell us that we live with inescapable uncertainty. We live with so-called epistemological uncertainty and ontological indeterminacy. What do they mean? So epistemological uncertainty is the idea that we can never escape the history of our own curiosity, that all the theories that we have about the social world, but also about the natural world in natural sciences, are built on our previous theories and our previous concepts. There's no Archimedean point where we can stand in the world and say, I see it. I read this history, I read this phenomena directly in an unmediated way. So we never can escape the contingency of our theories in terms of how we understand what we understand today. It's built on the shoulders of previous theories. It's not godlike knowledge. In terms of ontological indeterminacy, where this is particularly important for the social sciences as distinct from the natural sciences, is that social scientists are always examining people who are also examining themselves and each other. We are imaginative. We're not like gravity. We change our minds about what we think we're doing and when we're going to do it. And consequently, social science is always dealing with this contingency that because we are imaginative and there are new technologies and there are emerging novelties in complex systems, the social world is always becoming something else. And that means that we have this kind of inalienable, provisional nature of what we're doing when we're social scientists. So the idea that the economy is a watch and like God the watchmaker, we know how it works, which is the neoclassical conceit, would require everyone to operate like cogs in that watch and to also understand the entire mechanism so as not to breach its boundaries and change its structure, basically. So essentially what Soviet economics and neoliberal economics share is that they're basically secular theologies dressed up as sciences that are claiming to be scientific, but essentially they are claiming that they have transcended everything we know about the philosophy of science and have understood history directly. The riddle of history is solved. They have solved it, and we should govern according to those philosophies. So where the dark historical comedy comes in is because they're mirror image utopias. When you've got to translate the ideology into a procedure, they converge on exactly the same statecraft. They converge on the statecraft of quantification, output planning, target setting, managerial correct lines, the idea that all corporations will only be system consistent, all enterprises that are developed within the scope of the ideology must conform to the predictions of the ideology, so they'll only be socially productive. How's that going? They'll be efficient cogs in the systemic machine, whether that's the Soviet machine or the neoliberal machine. And of course, almost immediately, that turns out not to be the case. So let me try and illustrate what I'm saying in case you're still very skeptical and see if I can persuade you of how this is played out in the real political economy of Britain. So the fundamental philosophy of the new public management that came in with Margaret Thatcher and has proceeded in ever greater intensity ever since was that the state should be privatized as much as possible. And where it couldn't be privatized, the offices and administration of the state should be rebuilt in market-like ways, a kind of performance art of market-like organization. So it should be disaggregated, made agentified, made into sort of nominally competing units. There's a kind of bureaucratic Taylorism, the idea that you would try and make these sort of accord with the logic of a much more kind of rationalistic world, but with the idea that the market and the private sector is always morally and functionally superior to the public sector. So you're always trying to either devolve power to the private sector or you're trying to imitate a very idealized version of what the private sector does within the offices of the state. Now, the trouble with this is you can pick any, which is what I do in the book, you can pick any major policy, whether it's the reform of the state administration or external policies towards the political economy, and you can find the Soviet analogy. So let's take public sector outsourcing, for example. So the idea of public sector outsourcing is rooted in neoclassical models that said, imagine a market for public services. It would be a world of choice and competition. Instead of just going to the market to buy your cup of coffee, you could go and choose your school, you could choose your private, your health provider. It might be publicly funded, but if the providers were private and operating in a market for provision, you would get the best of all worlds. You'd get higher quality services for lower cost because the disciplines of the market would get you there. And so all of those models persuading both the Conservatives but also New Labour that outsourcing, we should outsource more and more, not just in general services, but also in things like the welfare state, indeed throughout the welfare state. So the story that's told is the only market-like analogy you can get, which that there'll be people who need services and private providers who provide them. It'll be a market for services. Now, because these are models built on argument from assumption, and they're closed system models, as all mathematical and formal models have to be, or even logical models, they're arguments that take some assumptions and follow them through to their kind of natural conclusions. The missing factor in that theory, the piece of organized forgetting in the theory, is the state, and the fact that the only financial market in public sector outsourcing is between the state and the enterprises who are providing the service, because they're being paid with taxpayers' money to do that. So when we created the academy school system, for example, or we started to outsource personal independence payments through Capita, or really pick any service and you can think of who we outsourced it to. What we were actually doing is transforming the British state into a giant of private enterprise planning. The market story is not the relationship between you and where you go for your service. The actual governmental relationship is between the state, who then becomes a giant of public procurement and enterprise management, but now with thousands of contracts. So in contrast to the Soviet system, they've created the Soviet planning enterprise system, only now it's for profit, and without a central planning organization. So what they've created is maximal informational fragmentation, and yet we're still a democracy. Democracy didn't get turned off when we started this utopia. So the state remains legally, politically, morally liable for the structures that it's created, but the structures that it's created then proceed to play out all of the pathologies of Soviet enterprise planning, only now in capitalist form, which is why the British state is working as well as it currently works. And it's also why, and we've recreated those pathologies at every level. So the state finds itself in bargaining games with large firms that it can never win, because the firms know that, well, the contract is maybe 10 years, 20 years, 30 years long. They know that there's no provider that they can go to other than themselves. So the state is absolutely over a barrel, and it can't say, to hell with you, we'll let you go bust, because then that fraction of the welfare state goes bust, for which they're politically liable. Now, the economists of the Soviet Union used to call this soft budget constraint, which was the idea that you can always nudge a little bit more for a few more resources in order to keep the system going, because without those extra resources, really significant parts of the state will fail, but also the political project will fail, which is why we've succeeded in cutting the public sector and cutting civil servants, but the cost of the state has gone up. So when people talk about the tax burden has never been higher, the thing journalists ought to ask is, where is it being spent? And the fact is, it's being spent through this fabulous devolved Soviet enterprise planning structure, but with added profit-taking.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below, or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.